I will after all not turn my head into a parchment, to scribble down on it all half-erased information from archives. Some have the business of the registry, but at some point someone needs to make a reasonable use of it. Pow, even if 9 parts out of 10 were erroneous and wrong. The mere attempt of his spirit is worthy of praise and copying. To read in order to think and not wanting to read thoughts. After all, we won't want to turn our brain merely into a gallery of paintings, or into a register, to note down names and figures of the objects of nature in it. Immanuel Kant. I now finish talking about Kant's methods of thinking. I talked about his architectonic method, through which our knowledge, our cognition can become scientific by starting with an idea of a science, of what that science should be and what the purpose of that science is, and from that idea deducing the parts and the structure that this science should have. And then I talked about his 3 methods of thinking that help us finding the truth. That is how the skeptical method is about suspending our judgment and first inquiring, investigating further, first trying to find more proof, and also not just proof in support of our side, but also making the other side as strong as possible. And then the critical method, which is about trying to not just give arguments why one side is right and one side is wrong, but also consider the source of one side's of opinion. Consider why, especially if I believe something is wrong, why it seems to be true to those holding that opinion. And thereby lift the illusion by explaining where it comes from. And then the sympathetic or participatory method, which is about not just dismissing an opinion as entirely wrong, but rather looking at the partial truth even in the error and trying to retain that truth, and trying, when there are different opinions that are both held in good faith and are both held by sharp minds, trying to consider that probably both hold some truth from a certain perspective, and trying to combine both of them into a middle position that contains both of them. Well, before I conclude this talking about Kant's methods, and before I move on to the content of Kant's actual philosophy that he arrived at through these methods, I want to talk about how to read books according to Kant. This is not so much a method of thinking as a method of reading, but it might still be of interest if you want to read philosophical books of your own. And there are still valuable thoughts, I think, that Kant has on this matter, that are worth talking about. And well, when asking how to read books, you can split this topic into 2 questions. One being, which books should you read? And the other being, how exactly should you read them? I want to answer both of those. Starting with the first. What does Kant say? Which books should you pick up? Well, first of all, he says it is probably good to read something which you are actually not thinking about at the time. And on the other hand, when you are thinking about and trying to form a position of your own on a certain topic, then while doing so, you should not read about that topic. It may seem counterintuitive at first, but basically what Kant is saying here is that if you read something on a certain topic, that will restrict your own genius, that will restrict your own thinking. Then you might not freely let your mind wander and come up with ideas, but you will probably already be pushed into a certain direction. I'm reminded of a remark of Freud, who said that he denies himself the pleasure of reading Nietzsche precisely because Nietzsche was such a great psychologist with such great insights into the human psyche, and because Nietzsche already before psychoanalysis found some of the same insights that psychoanalysis had, and therefore Freud didn't want to be influenced by reading Nietzsche, and didn't want it to limit his own thinking. So Kant would say, think about a thing for a while. While doing so, read books on other matters, concern yourself with other matters, and when you have come to your conclusions, when you have formed an opinion, then you may read again what others have written on that topic, and then you may consider their positions, their arguments, and thereby maybe modify the opinion that you previously arrived at. And also Kant would say, but this I think should be pretty obvious, he would say that when getting into a topic, like for example philosophy, you should first start with more general books to get an overview, and only later, when you have achieved that overview, should you go more into detail. He says at first it's better to read a long book which only contains a few ideas, but talks about those extensively, making everything clear, and only later may you read a shorter book which contains lots of ideas, not really explaining them, just sort of throwing them out there, because here you will have to do more work of your own, thinking about those ideas for yourself, thinking them further, understanding them by yourself. But which books to actually pick up? Well, Kant says you should only read good books, and it is better to read fewer books, but only good books, than to read lots of books who are bad or just mediocre. And indeed, I have never understood how people can waste their time by reading anything but the most excellent books, because I mean, there are still good books coming out every year probably, but even if that wasn't the case, even if anything new that was published was just shit, there were already so many good books written in the history of humanity that it is not possible within one human lifespan to read all of them. Meaning that every time you read even a mediocre book, you're wasting your time. You're denying yourself from reading something better. You will not get back that time before you die. And Kant would also say that every book you read should educate you. He was against books that provide merely entertainment and just fill your empty time. So I want to be clear here so that there are no misunderstandings. What Kant means by education. In fact, the German word is, I think, quite beautiful. It is Bildung. and this comes from Bild. Bild is image. So Bildung is being shaped into an image. It is the same word we would use for a mason, for someone who takes a block of stone and who shapes it, who forms it into a statue. Bildung is formation. I mean, this is also what the word information literally means, right? It's not just the data that you get and that you save up in your head, but rather it should be something that truly touches you, that truly informs you, gives you a form, transforms you, changes you as a human being. So what Kant is saying when he says you should only read books that educate you is not that you should only read theoretical books, that you are not allowed to read poems or novels or whatever. In fact, Kant himself did read those and quite liked those. But you should only read literature that educates you. For example, he says reading Shakespeare is good because Shakespeare presents true characters, true humans, and through his plays you can understand human nature better. Or for example, Kant was a big fan of the poems of Haller or of Pope because they were sublime and because in them, as he said, the graces are paired with wisdom. So they are both aesthetically pleasing but also contain a sort of wise philosophical content. Or Kant also liked satirical writings. He liked people like Montaigne, Jonathan Swift, Samuel Butler, Shaftesbury. Those he considered to be educating. What is important to him is that through the book you should understand the world, you should understand yourself better, you should gain a new perspective. The book should not be something that is just consumed passively to entertain you and to fill up your empty time. I'm reminded of a quote of Fichte, who compares this with a massage, who says, well, just like some people like their muscles squeezed, some people read books to sort of squeeze their brain or their mind, but then they go on with their lives and haven't really changed. No, the book should transform you in some way. What is also important to note here, though, is then when Kant says you should only read good books, he is not saying you should only read books that are right on everything. In fact, Kant says he would rather read a work of genius that is full of new ideas, even if it contains a lot of errors, than reading a book that is completely right and has no errors, but is shallow and only contains banalities. Genius to Kant always means original spirit. So the genius is he who has a new idea that hasn't been there before. And to Kant, that has value and that has merit and that deserves applause, even if that idea in the end turns out to be wrong. Because it can still help you. There's one example, one analogy he gives, and that is, he says, a sailor who goes out to reach a certain island, even if he ends up not reaching that island, but going somewhere else, he will still have seen something on his voyage. And so it might still be valuable to listen to his voyage, even if he went wrong, so to say. And I mean, just think of the Odyssey. I mean, Odysseus took 10 years wandering around the Mediterranean, trying to get to Ithaca, and for 10 years he didn't reach it, but he certainly had a lot to tell about. And so here you can think back on what I said when talking about the sympathetic method, saying that no one is ever completely wrong. There is only partial error, not absolute error. So even when someone has a wrong idea, even when someone constructs a wrong theory, there's maybe still some partial truths to be found in it. Or maybe it can still be an inspiration to you. It can still help you see things from a different perspective, and it can still lead to you yourself finding new ways of thinking. Maybe better ways than this author in his book, but still ways that he inspired. And therefore, Kant also says we should have respect for the genius, and we should have respect for those trying out new ways. Even if the ways in the end turn out to be wrong, it is still important, and we still learn something by learning that this way is a dead end, that this is not the way we must go, that we should look on for another way. I find there's a lot of again, sympathy in this, and a lot of regard and love for humanity. Unfortunately, many people don't have this stance. Many people, when they come to believe something is wrong, they just dismiss it. They just think it's stupid or it's ridiculous even, and it doesn't deserve being looked at. You can find that a lot in the history of thought and in the history of science, or rather in how we treat it today. I've often heard people say, oh, why would you read old books? Why would you read an old philosopher like Aristotle or whatever? Hasn't all of that been disproven? Isn't all of that just wrong? I mean, maybe so, but that doesn't mean that you still can't find something of value in great ideas, even if they are wrong ideas. And in the history of science, I find many people nowadays have this arrogance against the great attempts and the great trials that thinkers of the past went through. So when you have a theory like, for example, in Kant's day, there was the theory of the phlogiston in chemistry, a theory trying to explain the process of burning and oxidation. A theory that at the end of that century had been disproven, and that nowadays is often used as an example of a great scientific error. And I have heard people nowadays being very dismissive of it, treating it with great arrogance, saying it had no value at all. But the thing is, it was an honest attempt by the scientists of the day to better understand the world. They were not just charlatans or quacks. They were coming up with a theory that actually to some extent worked, and to some extent served as an explanation for certain phenomena. The theory turned out to be wrong ultimately, but still it had merit. And we should have respect for that. We can't just respect the winners, so to say. We have to respect those who in the end lost out too, especially since their losing still contributed something in many cases, still is something from which you can learn. And that is again why Kant recommends reading works of genius, even if they may be wrong on some things. And I can only agree with that. I have always been more interested in those than in maybe correct but trivial works. So I would read someone like Wilhelm Reich, for example. Was he right with his orgone theory? Was he wrong? That's not really for me to decide. But even if he was wrong, even if modern science may disprove him, I still find value in his thought, and I still can respect people like him, or I don't know, like Hahnemann. No matter what you think about homeopathy, I can still respect their honest attempts to find the truth and to go a new way that no one had gone before. And we need these people, even if sometimes they may fail and err. But moving on, how should we read a book once we have picked out the right book? Well, first of all, Kant recommends picking different times a day to read different things. This is part of his dietetics, which I talked about in my lecture on the philosopher as a healer. So Kant would say that maybe you should rather read the deep philosophical works earlier in the day, because he believes that in the morning the intellect is more sharp and has more control over the power of imagination, while in the evening he has less control over it and the power of imagination runs more freely. Kant would say that is also a reason why no one wants to hear ghost stories in the morning when the day is bright. But in the evening, when it's dark, people like to hear these stories because now their imagination can work with them and can sort of continue them. So therefore, he at some point says that it's better in the evening to collect new materials, so to read something that gives you new ideas to think about and new facts to incorporate into your system. And here your imagination, your power of imagination can run a little wild and sort of continue the new materials that you learn, sort of form new ideas from there. And then in the morning, you can sort of systematize them. But what really matters to Kant is that you don't always read the same thing, because that can be too heavy, that can be unhealthy. But that you switch it up a bit, just like with your body. You sit down at one point and at another point you go for a walk. You have to switch a bit. So Kant would actually recommend reading various books at the same time. Having a philosophical book, having something historical, having some piece of beautiful literature that you read. And that is indeed something I have often done, having my morning book, having my evening book I would read before going to sleep, having my toilet book, having my subway book, and having my main book I read, reading all of them at the same time. So I would say that this is not for everyone. Some people would probably get confused from this, reading one text and stopping in the middle of it, picking up another text, stopping, going back to the first text. So here I would say everyone needs to know himself and how his mind works. What is also important to Kant is that you try. This goes for theoretical works, this goes for works of philosophy. You try to read with your intellect and not with your senses. What he means by that is you must not let your senses cloud your judgment. This is basically what I talked about when talking about the critical method, that we make errors, our intellect makes incorrect judgments because of our subjective sensual perspective. So when a book is very beautiful, the writing style is beautiful, we might be tempted to also believe the content of what the book says to be true. But that, of course, must not always be the case. It's entirely possible that someone has a good style, but still is saying nonsense. And this is, of course, not just true for books. This is true in other cases as well. When a person is beautiful or is attractive, we might be more likely to consider them a good person, even though maybe they aren't. But maybe since they are attractive, we are excusing more of their bad behavior. There's the saying that love blinds you. I actually don't agree with that. I actually believe that true love is the opposite. True love makes you see. But what does blind you is being infatuated, is crushing. That indeed can blind you to what a person is really like. And therefore, when reading a book that is not meant to just be beautiful, but that is making certain statements, certain assertions, you must abstract from what it sounds like. This, of course, goes in both directions. So if the style is bad, you must not dismiss the content just because the book is probably not fun to read, just because it probably sounds boring. The content could still be very much true. Kant himself had this problem when reading Rousseau. Rousseau was very important to him, was probably alongside Hume one of the philosophers who influenced Kant's later thinking the most. But he would say that when he first read him, he found his style so beautiful that he had to read him several times till the style sort of lost its magic, and only then was he able to really consider the thoughts that Rousseau expressed, and only then did Kant trust himself to really judge the truth and the merit of those thoughts. Kant also considers it very important to memorize something, to keep something, to take something away when you read a book. It happens that someone reads a book and then maybe some weeks, some months later, he has read it completely, but he couldn't tell you a single thing about what he read. That would mean that you wasted your time, Kant would say. You should try to pick up one thing, even if it's a single thought or a single new fact. Once again, the book should transform you. It should educate you, so you should take something away from it. But now, how to actually read the book, how to actually engage with the text. Here, well, you should basically apply the methods of thinking that I talked about previously, the skeptical method, the critical method, the sympathetic method. Kant says that the author can't really speak for himself anymore. He is done, his text is written, so we should come to help him. And we should help him express his ideas. We should apply what today might be called the principle of charity. So we should not, even if something seems to not make sense, something we read, we should not immediately dismiss it. We should not immediately say, the author was clearly an idiot, he was clearly writing nonsense. But rather, we should always try to find reason in a text. I'm reminded of Lichtenberg, an 18th century German thinker whom Kant very much respected and whose writings Kant cherished. And Lichtenberg wrote a lot of great aphorisms. He is probably the greatest German aphorist before Nietzsche. And he once said, if a book and a mind collide and there's a sound of emptiness, it must not be the book. And also at another time he said, a book is like a mirror. When a monkey looks into it, a disciple won't look out of it. So unfortunately, I find very often that people will read in a very uncharitable way. They will read something that sounds wrong to them or that sounds bad to them, and then they will immediately dismiss the author. And I found that in philosophy too. I have found when studying that many of my co-eds did exactly this, and I always thought, who do you think you are? You're probably not a particularly great thinker, and you are currently in your very first year of studying. You're just getting to know philosophy, but already you are having your judgments. Already you dare to dismiss Kant, for example. I mean, I already addressed that in my lecture on Kant's life. I said Kant spent over a decade being silent, not writing new works, but really thinking through his critical system. Does that mean that he is correct on everything, that he can't have made an error? No, certainly not. But it means that if you read him and an error immediately springs into your eyes, you see an obvious error the first time you read it, the error is probably in you and not in Kant. Because Kant, once again, he spent over 10 years working on this, and he probably was a greater mind than you are. So we could probably assume that if there are errors in his thoughts, they are not so obvious that they can be seen immediately and without really considering his whole system and really thinking it through. Because if they had been this obvious, he probably would have seen them himself. So what you should do is being charitable. What you should do is trying to employ the skeptical method, suspend your judgment, employ the critical method. Ask yourself, if I think the author is wrong, how come that he is wrong and still thinks that he is right? And employ the sympathetic method. Believe that he is not completely wrong, he is not completely evil. He probably has some point. It probably makes sense from his perspective, so try to get into that perspective and get to a perspective from which it makes sense. Kant praises, for example, Montesquieu for doing this, for as he says, trying to assume, when he looks at the laws that humans gave, trying to assume that the laws are not just silly. And I mean, if you look around, you can find laws that seem very silly nowadays. I mean, there are lists you can find online of silly laws, but usually there's a story behind there. Usually that silly law was given for a reason. And Kant praises Montesquieu for trying to assume that behind each law there was a rational purpose, there was a rational attempt to achieve something with that law. And as Kant says, by assuming that, and therefore by trying to find the reason in each law, he indeed finds a lot of valuable things. And so Kant says, help the author out. Even if the author did indeed write a text that's not perfect, maybe he gave an imperfect argument, maybe he didn't explain himself right, so his text can easily be misunderstood. Or maybe he indeed wrote something that's not completely correct. Don't just be happy about being able to bash and dismiss the author, but rather try to understand the author better than he understood himself. That's something Kant says one time in relation to Leibniz, but that of course can be applied to any author. Kant says you should not try to just understand what the author wanted to say or what he actually said. You should try to understand what he should have said. So it should not be about, your interpretation of a text should not mainly be about getting into the author's mind. It should mainly be about finding truth. So even if the author was wrong, maybe you can still give his words a spin that make them right. So here Kant is already somewhat applying a concept that we have nowadays, the concept of the death of the author, which should be employed even if the author happens to still be alive. You should dismiss the author as a person. You should not ask what is it that the author wanted to say, but rather you should ask what is it that the text can tell us. And as one of my professors in literature used to say, a text can be smarter than its author. So it is entirely possible, for example, that you read a text, I don't know, that you read a book written by a racist author, and in the book there are immigrants or there are black people who are criminals, and the author wrote it like that because he's racist. But maybe in the text it happens to be the case that these people never really had a chance or a perspective in life. Because of a racist white society oppressing them and pushing them to the fringes of society, maybe they never really were given a chance to be anything else but criminals. And that's probably not what the author wanted to say if he's racist, but maybe his text actually shows that. So in that sense, the text is smarter than the author. We just have to see it. And this is something that, if you think about it, we already apply, or at least should apply, in daily lives. This charitable reading, this not just looking at the mere letter, as Kant would say, of a text, but looking at its spirit. So when someone tells me, I hate insects, I find insects disgusting, I'm not going to show him pictures of spiders. And when he freaks out, I'm not going to say, oh, what's your problem? You just said you don't like insects. Spiders are not insects. They have 4 legs instead of 6. Because either the person knows that spiders are not insects and just in that situation didn't choose the most clear, the most specific words, or maybe the person indeed does not even know that spiders are not insects. But whatever the case, I'm going to assume that he probably didn't mean to say that he doesn't like insects in the strict biological sense, but rather what he meant to say is that he doesn't like those small many-legged creatures. Whether the biologists might classify them as insects or whatever. Or for example, when someone tells me that all triangles have 180 degrees, of course I can dismiss him. Of course I can ridicule him. Because of course I can understand these words in a way that makes them wrong, if I really want to. I can say, oh, you idiot, you clearly don't even know the basics of math. So first off, 180 degrees is only true for the inside angles of a triangle. If we look at the outside angles, they don't have 180 degrees if we add them up. And I can also say this is only true for Euclidean triangle on a plane field. This is not true if it's curved. And again, it is possible that either the person actually didn't know this, or maybe he even did know this, but he was just speaking colloquially and didn't want to get that specific, that precise in his speaking. Either way, I should try to be charitable, to be sympathetic, and to give his words, if possible. This is not about completely twisting the words to give them a sense that absolutely can't be given to them, just so that they make some sense. But if possible, I should try to interpret his words in a way that makes them have the most truth that they can possibly have. And once again, here it's not even important what the author himself was thinking, because it's not about him, it's about truth. It's only important how the words should be understood. And if you think about it, that is, for example, how judges should work. The judge should not ask, when judging according to a law, he should not ask what did the lawgiver mean by that law, but rather how should that law be understood? What understanding makes this law have the most sense, even if it maybe wasn't the understanding the lawgiver himself had. So, for example, in our modern Western democracies, you often have constitutions saying in one way or the other that all people should be equal. If you go by what the lawgivers who wrote those constitutions actually meant by that, they probably weren't speaking about homosexual people. Back then, when those constitutions were written, the lawgivers probably didn't support equality for gay people. I mean, if they had supported it, they would have given it to them. But in a lot of cases, in a lot of countries, homosexuality was still illegal for a long time, even when that constitution was in place saying there should be equality. But nowadays, if a gay person feels that some law is unfair, is oppressing gay people, he can go to the Supreme Court of his country and he can insist that the Constitution says all people should have equal rights. And the Supreme Court might rule in his favor and might say, yes, according to the Constitution, we have to, for example, allow gay marriage. So it is not about what the fathers of the Constitution actually wanted, but they were actually thinking about when they wrote the text. It is about how should we reasonably interpret the text so that it becomes the most rational, so that it makes the most sense, so that it is the most true. When reading Kant's text, you can see him apply this, especially in two cases. So, not asking what did the author of a text consciously mean, consciously want to say, but rather how should the text be understood? What would be a reasonable reading of the text? One such case is Leibniz. Leibniz, probably the greatest German philosopher before Kant. Leibniz did influence the Leibniz-Wolffian school of philosophy, which was the school of thought most German thinkers previous to Kant subscribed to. And it was this Leibniz-Wolffian school that Kant's own critical philosophy mainly attacked. However, he didn't mean to attack Leibniz himself. He respected Leibniz, and he actually said that the Leibniz-Wolffian school read Leibniz in a dogmatic way that made Leibniz say a lot of wrong things. While on the other hand, the critique of pure reason, far from making Leibniz look stupid and far from dismissing everything Leibniz had said, was actually the true apology of Leibniz, because through the critique you become able to understand Leibniz in a way that makes the things he said actually true. I don't want to get into this too deeply. I may give a few more examples in future lectures when I talk about the critique of pure reason. But just one example, there was the debate on concepts that are given to us from birth. Leibniz talked about such concepts that we have from birth, and Kant would say, if you take that literally, it is wrong. I mean, how is that supposed to work? Did God put certain concepts, like the concept of causality would be an example, did he just put them into our minds so that we are born with them? No. But Kant says you have to read that in context. Leibniz was not making an empty claim out of nowhere. He was in a debate. He was basically responding to Locke and to Locke's empiricism. Locke had said that we took our concepts from experience. So I see dogs and I form a concept of the dog. I see mountains, I form a concept of mountains. And to that, Kant says, Leibniz had responded, yes, that is true for empirical concepts, but there are certain concepts, like causality, that we don't arrive at through experience, but rather we already have before all experience. So we have from birth, so to speak. We have them a priori. And in that sense, Kant says this is very much true. This doesn't mean that these concepts are just in our minds from birth. They do get formed throughout our lives, but they get formed not by experiencing these things, such as causality, but rather they get formed by us thinking in a certain way, processing, so to speak, our perceptions in a certain way, and then abstracting from the way we process things, and from that forming certain general a priori concepts. Again, I will explain this further in future lectures so that it will probably make more sense. But this is how Kant tries to bring sense into Leibniz. And the other example is Kant's reading of Revelation, which of course in his case means the Bible, but which can be applied to other revelations like the Quran or whatever. Where he also says we must not ask what did some holy author like Paul, what did he actually mean? What did he actually believe? What did he actually want to sing? He could have been wrong. He could have misunderstood himself, or even if you want to say he had some divine inspiration, he could still have misunderstood that divine inspiration. So what we have to ask is, what sense do we have to give the holy text so that it makes sense, so that it is in accordance with the idea of a wise and holy and benevolent God. This is, of course, the opposite of what many people, and especially fundamentalists, do. They will say, well, the text says that it is forbidden to be gay, that you go to hell if you are gay. So if God decided that, if God says so, then it is forbidden to be gay. But to that, if you are a rational person, you would have to reply, but this can't be forbidden by God. God would not turn people gay. He would not make people be born as gay and then tell them, but now if you actually act onto your gayness, then you will go to hell. That would be cruel and evil. That would be something that maybe the devil would do, to just torture people and make their life harder, but that a good and wise God wouldn't do. So if a good and wise God wouldn't do such a thing, and if it is written here, and if we still want to assume that this is indeed the revelation of a good and wise God, then we have to somehow find another interpretation that makes the text and what it says fit to the idea of a good and holy and wise and benevolent God. This also is something I will talk more about much later when I talk about Kant's philosophy of religion, but I already wanted to address this here. These are the two main examples you can find in his own text of how he reads the text in a charitable way and how he tries to make a text as reasonable and as correct as possible. But to get to the last point, what Kant says when you read a text, especially a philosophical text, what you should try to do is understand the main idea of the author. Because every author has such a main idea. He has something he wants, some aim, some purpose that his text serves. And you can only truly understand the text if you understand that purpose. It is not enough to understand the individual parts of the text. It is not enough to understand specific arguments that the author makes. You have to ask yourself, what purpose does the argument serve? What is the main point the author tries to make? So you could say in a way that this goes back to Kant's architectonic method, and that what Kant is saying here is you basically need to understand the architectonic of the author. Once again, the architectonic was about having an idea and the parts deriving from that idea. And now you sort of have to go the opposite way. You, of course, read the various parts of a book, but you have to understand how they are necessary within the whole, how they all came from the author's idea. And only that way can you judge them. Otherwise, it might sometimes seem like maybe this thing the author wrote was unnecessary. Maybe here the author seems to be making a digression. Maybe here the author seems to be going off topic. But maybe you actually didn't understand what his true topic is. Maybe with the aim he had, that digression actually became quite necessary and important. Maybe it actually isn't a digression as it first seems to be, but rather maybe it serves to give an important example, or maybe it serves to introduce a new perspective onto the main point. And that is something you can only judge and understand once you understood what the main point is, once you got the idea of the author. And Kant is very much aware that this is the hardest part. This is also why he says that you should read a good book, a deep book, a book of genius several times. And I would add to that that it can be helpful to not just read one book of a great thinker, but several books, or even all of his books. And maybe it is best to read them all chronologically. Of course, you can't do that with many thinkers. Life is not long enough for that. Maybe you have to pick 1 or 2 or 3 thinkers with which to do that. But I have done that several times. I've done that with Kant, I've done that with Nietzsche, I've done that with Fichte. And I can say that every time it really helped me. When you find a thinker who really deserves that, who deserves that much of your time and effort, it can be very valuable to read through all of his works, even maybe the less important ones, because through that you can approach his idea, especially since his idea might never be stated explicitly. Many thinkers, precisely because they were the first to have a certain new idea, only had that idea in an unclear or unconscious way. Many thinkers don't quite grasp their own idea yet. They only approach that. Here again, it becomes important to understand an author better than he may have understood himself. And that is why you should read a good book several times, Kant says, not necessarily because of the individual arguments and so that you understand the arguments better, but rather to get into what he calls the thinking mode or the character of the author and to be influenced by those, to learn to sort of assume the author's perspective and to sort of think in the same way as he thought and to care about the same things as he cared about. Kant therefore recommends to, especially when reading a book the first time, really focus on that idea. Don't focus so much on specific points or specific arguments. Also, don't ask if the individual points are correct or if some argument is incorrect. First, you need to get the main idea. I will add to that and recommend to read on if you don't understand something the first time. I've often heard people, when it comes to philosophical texts, say, oh, I started reading someone, like for example Kant, but then at some point I couldn't follow anymore. It became too complicated and so I stopped. That, I would say, is not the right way to read it. I've also come across parts I didn't understand. I will not pretend to be such a great mind that I immediately understood every single statement a philosopher made when I read it the first time. But what I have never done is stop and put a book away entirely just because I didn't understand a passage. I've always just read on. And sometimes I may have read on for dozens or hundreds of pages without understanding a word, or even for several books. So when I first read Fichte from start to finish, there are some books which I barely understood at all. And then I read something in a very late text from maybe 1812 or something. So I read Fichte chronologically and he died in 1840. So one of his last texts. And there I read something and it finally clicked. And now when I go back to earlier texts, I understand them much better. It is not so important to understand everything right away. It is important to get into the mode of thinking this author has. And to get what he is all about, what his aim is. Then it becomes much easier to later on, with time, step by step, understand his individual arguments. So what Kant recommends is, read it the first time, try to grasp the idea, don't stop because some argument isn't clear. Kant also recommends maybe make notes on the side, and then before you read the book a second time, first look at your notes. First try to get into the main idea again, and then try to sort of reconstruct the book, sort of reconstruct the arguments. Because if you really grasp the idea, it should not be necessary to reread every single sentence, but rather you should sort of be able to re-employ the architectonic that the author employed to, from that idea, deduce the parts, deduce the arguments that become necessary from that idea. And then once you have done that, then you can read the book a second time and check, so to say. And now you can also try to get more into the specific arguments and to understand each of them, and also to see if they are actually correct or not. That is the tip Kant gives here. It is very unfortunate that this trying to not just get an author's arguments and get an author's points, but actually get his idea, get what he was really about. It is very unfortunate that this is rarely ever done. Certainly not by lay people who may pick up one book of that author and read it on the side. But even at university, it is rarely done. And when you hear about certain philosophers like Kant, you will usually only hear about pieces. You will hear what is Kant's categorical imperative, or what is Nietzsche's Übermensch, or what is Plato's theory of the ideas. And one reason for this is probably that the unaufklärt people, they themselves don't have such an idea that reigns them, that rules their life, and from which their whole system of thinking is derived. Everything in their head is just pieces, it's just opinions that don't even fit with each other. In Kant's language, the unaufklärt, their thinking is an aggregate. It is not a system. And they have the biggest issue. I would go so far as to say that this is probably the one thing that is hardest for them. They have the biggest issue to grasp what a system is, to go beyond the pieces, and to also not just fit the pieces together, but rather to start from the top, to start from the idea and to see how the pieces flow by necessity from that idea. Well, to me it is important to not just talk about isolated parts of Kant's thinking, like his categorical imperative or his transcendental idealism. I will talk about all of that in due time. But what I want is to give you the idea behind Kant's whole system. Now, whether I will manage to do that or not, time will tell, and other people will have to judge. But at least that is my aim. And with that, I have given a help for interpreting my own philosophical work, because that, of course, is part of my idea. To not just speak about philosophers' specific philosophical points or theories, but to get across the idea that guided them. And here, to finish this off, I once again want to stress that Kant's philosophy, Kant's critique of reason, which I will now, with my next lecture, start to get into, this is what helps us and what can give us a fundament to better understand philosophers' ideas, not just Kant's own, but also other philosophers. Since he has worked out the structure of reason and the way reason works, and since he provides us with an architectonic system of reason, he can help us understanding other thinkers better than they understood themselves. That is why I stay firm in my belief that studying philosophy should probably start with studying Kant. And the whole history of philosophy, the whole history of Aufklärung, is the history of clarification. I already talked about this in previous lectures, how, like in my lecture on metaphysics, how philosophy doesn't bring truly new knowledge. It brings more clarity in that which we already unconsciously know. And for that reason, I would say that when we come to newer authors, they had more and more clarity about themselves, about their own idea. So here it becomes less and less about understanding them better than they understood themselves. But on the other hand, if you go further into the past, like into antiquity or the Middle Ages, here, especially in the times before Kant and his critical turn, that same clarity was not yet achieved. So here it becomes especially important if you want to understand an author and truly learn something from an author. Here it becomes important to have this fundament which Kant can give you and which hopefully I can help you understand better. My deep thanks be to my supporters: Thomas Deuringer, Garnau Klaufen, Benjamin Lehning, Oblomov, Samet Özkilic, Christos Pai, Alexander Reuter, Lisa Rinner, Elif Özün, Yasin Özün, as well as to all others who support me and my Aufklärung course.